Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 104, and today we're going to be talking about a concept that has some traction in Magic World, but I don't think it has ever been explored using data. Princeliness and popperiness of the formats. We are in a bit of a lull between LCI and Murders at the Karlov Manor, so I thought I'm going to make something universal, looking through all the sets from the last couple of years and trying to figure out which one of those were Prince and Pauper. But before we do that, I would like to thank my sponsors. First of all, mtgazone.com. I'm going to try to write something about Prince and Pauper for the weekend for the website so that you can have a reading version of this podcast. But also thanks to my patrons. And I abandoned you. I'm really sorry, but I had guest after guest after guest in the last weeks. And I couldn't have properly dedicated time to thanking my patron. But thanks to my patrons who joined around the Christmas period: Pat, Aaron, Christian, Jack, Laura, and Sam. And some of you are already very, very active in the Discord, in the patron channels, in the general channels. And actually, a bunch of new patrons were involved in helping me with the brainstorming for this episode. So, this is one of the advantages you have as a member of the patron, being in my Discord, having access to ask questions, having access to help me with the streamlining of the ideas for the episode. So today's episode is going to be about whether formats are princely or poppery. And we're going to start defining it, but generally there is this vague idea that some formats are more rare driven, and we're going to be discussing what does it exactly mean. And some formats are more based on common and uncommon cards, and rares are absolutely unnecessary for a success in that particular format. And we're going to try to figure out whether we can detect signal of that using data, what are the traps involved with that, what are the methods that we will be using for detecting those things using the data, and what does it mean for a format to be poppery and princely. But before we go into that, my traditional preamble. And today's it's going to be topical with the new set being released. The new mechanic for the murders at the Karlov Manor is Disguise, which creates a sort of morph. So you use tap 3 mana, you make a 2/2 creature, but it does have ward 2. And putting ward on morphs is a design masterstroke, according to me. After playing, I played morphs when they originally released, but I barely remember anything from those times. It's been decades ago. But recently I played a bit of Khans of Tarkir with the morph mechanic. And one thing that morph limits in a set is 1 and 2 drops and cheap removal. You can't put cheap removal in a set with morphs because you can't pay 3 mana to play the 2/2 vanilla Grey Ogre kind of creature, only to have it shocked. But if the morph has a ward, shock costs 3 mana to target it. But it still costs 1 mana to target a 1-drop or a 2-drop. It also means that in this type of set, you can put a bunch of 1 and 2 drops. So the set does not necessarily have to be super glacial, because you can also have a cheap removal to deal with those 1 and 2 drops. And that cheap removal is still not going to be very efficient against the morphs that have ward 2. So I think adding the word on the morphs by the design team was an absolute masterstroke, and I'm super impressed about how many lines of set design it opened just to put that one ability on top of the morph and allow it not to die to any kind of removal spell, any kind of ability. It's a great modification of morph, and I think it gives an opportunity for this format to be fun. One hope that I have is that adding the word will not generate a situation when 1 and 2 drops are going to be so powerful that morphs are going to become irrelevant. And it's going to be interesting to see how they manage to navigate this particular avenue. But we can only tell that when we see the full set released, when we start playing our pre-releases, when we see the full spoiler, then we're going to start speculate about it. So far, I'm super thrilled about what the design team has done. I really like that they put some extra cards on Arena through the list cards that are not going to be in the paper boosters. That's really healthy for the environment. I do like that they reprint Shock in the set with Morph, because they managed to slightly rejig how the Morph mechanic works. I do like all the other mechanics in there. I like that there are some artifact synergies without specifically making it into an artifact set. So I think it's going to be pretty cool to discover what's going on in that set and figure it out. But okay, since we know so little, I'm not going to dedicate more time and space to Karlov Manor. Hopefully, we're going to be talking about it in a week or two. Now, let's talk about, well, first patron questions of the week. These are the questions from my higher tier patrons. One of them comes from Lucky Gal. There is a sense by some that the Prince formats are less skill testing than Pauper formats. Do we see less polarization in win rates in sets where the power is more concentrated in the rares or mythics? That's from Lucky Gal. And second question, which is sort of the same different side of the same aspect, is like, if the rares do add variance, does the variance actually pull more player win rates towards average? So, well, Lucky Gal basically asks if power concentrated in rares and mythics makes the win rate more deconcentrated, while Jack is asking if the rares pull the variance towards the average, pull the win rates, player win rates towards the average, so decrease the variance. And we're going to come back to those questions later. I'm not going to answer them right now, but the idea is that we're going to go through the whole episode and try to figure out and end with at least an attempt to answer those questions. So, what makes a format Prince or Pauper? And there are two main schools of thought that I know of, at least. Correct me if I'm wrong, but one of them is that Prince formats are the ones where high rarity cards are disproportionately powerful. And this means that, rares are really strong, rares are really powerful, and because of that, you need rares to win games, and it's a sort of lottery to open a good, powerful rare in the particular format. If you manage to do that, you're going to be having a good chance of winning your draft. If you didn't, then you're going to have an uphill struggle in princely formats. While in pauper formats, you are not at the whim of what's being opened in terms of rares, because lower rarity cards can perfectly win games, and there is no need to have rares. You can do without. There's also a second school of thought, and actually, when I think about Prince Pauper formats, I'm more thinking about this particular definition. And in that definition, princely formats are defined as that there are no good ways to deal with powerful cards, making them take over the game, which means that there is a disconnect between threats at higher rarity and answers to those threats at lower rarity, and those answers just cannot catch up with the threats, and because of that, rares take over, not because they are powerful, but because they are hard to answer to. So how to measure any of those things? And I decided to look at 4 different ways of trying to measure how we do that. One, we count the fraction of high rarity cards among the most winning cards. 2, we look at the availability of good cards in the particular format, and we see if it's high availability. I would assume that this is a pauper set, and if it's low availability, I would assume that it's a princely set. 3, we have a high rarity enrichment in winning decks. That means that the winning decks have many more rares than the not winning decks. And 4, we can look at the win rate distribution and then try to answer the questions that we had from the 2 patrons that I mentioned. So first thing I measured was the fraction of top cards, and that was actually something that Lucky Gal started on Discord asking about it after the episode with Alex last week, and I thought, oh, that's actually a good question, because by answering this question, I can answer so many more other things, and I started digging a bit in the data and trying to figure those things out. So what I did is that, of course, the problem when you start measuring new things is that you don't know exactly at which level you're going to have some kind of interesting finds in a particular metric, because a metric is very important. If I pick like top 10 cards of the format and look at their rarity, well, in most formats, the top 10 cards in the format are all going to be rare and mythic. So I'm not going to find anything by looking at the top 10 cards. If I look at top 200 cards, well, probably all rares are in top 200 cards, except for some really F constructed tier things. So that won't also tell me anything except for the number of Fs in the format. So in order to measure something that might be interesting and different between different formats, I have to be probably somewhere between looking at the top 10 cards of the format and top 200 cards of the format, and trim them down just to see where do I see any kind of interesting interaction between those values. So I decided to look at the top 100 cards of the format in terms of the game in hand win rate, top 50 cards of the format in terms of game in hand win rate, and top 25 cards by game in hand win rate, and calculate what fraction of those cards are rare and mythic, really, and try to use those three categories to identify the most informative cutoff. And also, I wanted to see what percent of rares from the format make it to this cutoff. And these are two different things. One is what percent of the cards in top 100 are rares and mythic, and the other thing is what percentage of rare and mythic cards make it to top 100. Different questions, and they answer slightly different things. Okay, so let's start with this graph. These are last 11 sets from Midnight Hunt, Crimson Vow, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, Streets of New Capenna, Dominaria United, Brothers War, Fire Obi-Wan, March of the Machine, Lord of the Rings, Wilds of Eldraine, and Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And I looked at what percentage of the cards make it to top 100, top 50, and top 25 game and hand win rate. Generally, around 30% of the cards in the format are rare and mythic. In case of some formats, it's going to be slightly more. For example, in Brothers War and in March of the Machine and in WoW, it was above 30% because there is an additional card slot for the enchantments, artifacts, or legendary creature in those formats. But generally, the rule of thumb is that there is roughly 30% of rares and mythics. But if we look at the top 100 cards of the format, top 100 in terms of game in hand win rate, you will see that it is around 40-45% of the cards are rares and mythics. So there's a slight enrichment in the top 100 already. It still looks quite flat between different formats. We see one specific outlier in March of the Machine, where there's 61% of the top 100 cards are rare and mythic, and this has something to do with the fact that there is a legendary creature slot for the bonus sheet for that particular set. There is also another outlier in Lord of the Rings, where only 33% of the top 100 cards were rare and mythic. So then I went to a slightly more refined level, look at the top 50 cards as per game in hand win rate, and there we can actually see quite a diversity in results, because in Lord of the Rings, 40% of the top 50 cards are rare or mythic. When you look at March of the Machine, it's 80% of the top 50 cards are rare or mythic. So like twofold difference between the best and the worst set. And there's quite a lot in between, because we see Streets of New Capenna, around 55% of the cards are rare and mythic in those top 50 game and win rate cards. In Brothers War, 70%. So, we have quite a big spread of what's going on. And when you look at the top 25 cards, we actually see that it's pretty boring. Around 80% of the cards in the top 25, independently of the format, are going to be rare and mythic, except for one set, Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings has only 48% of the cards in the top 25 are rare and mythic, and it was a very strange result, but also something that we can look into in a second. So here we have this one maybe visualized better. This is the top 50 cards by a game and win rate. You see Lord of the Rings, 42% of the cards in top 50 are rare mythic. Streets of New Capenna, Kamigawa, Neon Dynasty, Midnight Hunt, around 60%. So these would be the formats that are more paupery than princely. These only have around half, maybe 60, maybe 40, maybe 60, 40%, maybe 60% of the cards in the top 50 cards by game and win rate are going to be rare. So there's going to be at least 40% of the cards that are really, really strong that are lower rarity. On the other hand, in things like MUM, LCI, Brothers War, we have around 70-80% of the rares in the top 50 cards by game and win rate. So only 20-30% of those good, really powerful cards are going to be rare, which of course will impact the availability of those cards. And because it will impact the availability of those cards, in order to have really powerful cards, you have to be fortunate with opening higher rarity things. Okay, then when we look at the top 25 cards by game and win rate, you see not much difference. Bunch of sets have 76% of the top 25 cards as rare. Bunch of sets have 84-88% in that range in the top 25. And only one set is really outside of that 76-88% range. That's Lord of the Rings. 48% of the top 25 cards are rares and mythics, which means that over a half of top 25 cards are actually commons and uncommons. Most of them are very powerful red and black uncommons in this set. So looking at those two results, I can already see that using the top 25 cards is probably a waste of time. There is just not enough information in that level. I don't see any separation between different sets, so it's not going to be an interesting result to analyze. Looking at the top 50, that seems to be where the money is. Looking at top 100 also was slightly samey between different sets. There was not much disproportion there. I didn't even make a graph about it. So I think that looking at the top 50 cards, it is still an arbitrary kind of cutoff, but I think it's an arbitrary cutoff that has some interesting reasons to be used. But there is this another metric that we can look at, and that is the percentage of the rare and mythic cards that did make it to the top 50 cards of the format. And here we have actually quite some difference. In Lord of the Rings, only 28% of rares and mythics made it to the top 50 cards, while in LCI, the opposite end of the spectrum, 42% of all the rares and mythics in the format made it into a top 50. Normally we have around 80%, 80 rares and mythics in the format, maybe 85. So that would mean that around 40, around maybe 37 or 35 of those rares would make it to the top 50. So they will constitute like around 70%. And in fact, in LCI, it is around 70% of the top 50 cards are rare. And there is a good linear progression between the sets. You will see that at the lower level of the spectrum, we will see Lord of the Rings, which had few rares in top 50 in general, but also all those three sets that had a bonus sheet, because they will have more rares and therefore fewer rares can make the top 50. Also, those bonus sheet rares will frequently be constructed plans or maybe commander plans that are not really good in draft, and therefore they will not make the top 50 cards category. So that's why you will see maybe slightly lower numbers of those rares making top 50. But there is also in the sets that did not have the special bonus sheet, we still can see quite a decent separation. It's like Streets of New Capenna, 35% of the rares made top 50. and then it just progresses upwards until Crimson Vow and Dominaria United at around 40%, also LCI at around 40%. And if 40% of the rares make the top 50 cards, that would to me mean that this is, at least in some kind of way, a princely format, because so many rares are in those top echelons by game and hand win rate. There's so few of the cards that are lower rarity in there. And actually, when you think about it, Crimson Vow was one of those sets where people say, oh, the bombs are too strong in Crimson Vow. It's a very bomby format. I think it was one of the really last sets that I can recall where the discussion about whether a set is Prince or Pauper has been a real discussion, and there was a real talk about it. After that, it was mainly, discarded as, this is a sort of like Prince and Pauper are terms that we don't use anymore. But actually, I think that there is something to look at the power of the rares versus power of the commons in the format if you are planning your strategy for particular things. Okay, that covers the fractions of rare cards in the top winning cards. But that's not the only way of measuring it. The other way is measuring availability of good cards. And here we are actually looking at something that is similar to the openness measure that I'm sometimes using in the early data analyses. Just basically looking how many of a card for each particular, I don't know, win rate tier or color combination you will see in a draft pot. So the idea is that the more good cards you see during the draft, the more paupery is the format. Because if you see more good cards, that means that probably more good cards are actually at the common, uncommon tier of rarity. And because of that, you will see more of them because you see more commons. Even if they are picked early, it will be hard for you to see more of a particular rare than more of a particular common. And then I've obviously used normalized win rate data for all the formats. And I use my tier list for analyzing which cards are good. And then I can compare which set had more cards that had a high grade. And by high grade here, I'm talking about higher than B minus or higher than B or higher than B plus. And I measured all of those things. So here is the general graph. We have those same 11 sets. And we see that there is some difference between how many B minus or higher level cards will you see per draft pot. So for example, in Midnight Hunt, you will see 24 Bs, B minus or higher during a draft, while in Wilds of Eldraine, you will only see 17.3 Bs or B minuses or higher. And in LCI is going to be around 18. So most formats are around between 18 and 22 in this range. There are 3 formats that are above it, and that's Midnight Hunt, Phyrexia Obi-Wan, and March of the Machine. These are driven by a large number of powerful commons in those particular 3 formats. Powerful commons that were also widely available. Like for example, in one, Chimney Rabbles and a bunch of other red commons were going quite late, even in the late format, and therefore they inflated the number of really solid cards that you will be able to see during the draft. But if you go one level higher, cards that have grade of B or higher, according to my grading scale, see similar things. So Woe, Brothers War are the sets where you see fewest of the cards. And remind you that Brothers War was actually also one of the sets where you fewest of the rares made into the top 50, and also one of the sets where you had more of the rare and mythic cards in the top 50 cards, for example. So all those things seem to be pointing that Brothers War is one of those sets that were slightly more princely than paupery. At the same time, Midnight Hunt, Phyrexia Obi-Wan, Lord of the Rings, we see quite a lot of cards that would be or higher, especially in Midnight Hunt. 16 cards on average per draft pod. You will see that have a grade of B or higher, according to my grading scale. In Phyrexia Obi-Wan, it's 12 cards per pod that you will see that have a grade of B and higher. And in Lord of the Rings, around 9.7. And then it starts dropping: 9.5 for LCI, 9 for Mom, 8.6 for Neo, 8 for Crimson Vow and DMU, and Streets of New Capenna. And then we go down to 6.5 for WoW and Bro. When we go one level higher, even for the B plus or higher cards, we still see that Midnight Hunt and 1 are on top. You will see C6 B pluses or higher per draft. That's quite a lot. In Mom, you will see 5 of those, and then it drops to 4 for Brothers War, LCI, Streets of New Capenna. And if you go completely down, you will see roughly 2 B pluses or higher on average for DMU and WoW. So these two sets have quite little of that super high power top end, which means that probably most of the cards that are that have high grades are going to be rare or mythic. So there's going to be barely any uncommons or commons in that category for DMU and WoW, while you will definitely see some uncommons and most likely even commons in Phyrexia Obi-Wan and mid for the B plus or higher category. Same for March of the Machine. But the availability of cards at higher grades, so at higher win rates, really, when we look at it, does not necessarily mean that this format is very paupery. It can mean another thing, and that's very important. It can mean that one color or one color pair is so much better than the rest that even mediocre commons from that particular color pair will have high win rate, and therefore will be, according to my measurements that are based on win rate, in higher tier list. So I looked at the availability of cards that have a B minus or higher grade in the format, but split it for each color. And when you look at it, you will see a couple of things that are pretty interesting, and maybe things that we sort of knew but never specified. And one thing that really struck me in that graph is that the blue cards are so much more available, format after format after format after format after format. So we have 11 formats here, and in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them, in 7 of them, blue is the most available color in terms of having good card. The y-axis here is not a percentage; it's how many good cards that are B minus or higher you will see per average draft pod. So if you would interpret the Midnight Hunt here, you will see around 10 good blue cards, around 6 good white cards, around 5 good black cards, around well, sorry, not 5, but 2.5 good black cards, around 2 green cards, and 0 good red cards. And this is the format, like very disproportionate towards white and blue color combinations in Midnight Hunt. And of course, people do remember that that blue-black decks in Midnight Hunt were good, and you could force them early days. But actually, when you look at the data from later of the format, blue-white decks were better than that, and easier to force in the later part of the format. But of course, people do remember the early days of the format the best, and especially when like people like LSV drafted 16 times in a row. And we see some sets that are dominated by one color, like March of the Machine, where you saw on average almost 12 good blue cards, and the second most open sort of color in terms of those powerful cards was black with 4. So like threefold difference between the two. You see some colors like Lord of the Rings, where black was the most powerful color. You saw average of 8 good black cards, and then 4 blue, 4 red, and nothing from green and white. It was basically a Grixis color in terms of what was open. And you see some formats like Crimson Vow, where actually almost every color was slightly open. Another thing that you can see, blue is definitely like the powerful color of the last 2 years, except for a couple of formats when it was absolutely atrocious, like Brothers War, like Phyrexia Obi-Wan, like Wilds of Eldraine. Maybe not completely atrocious, but definitely not good. But what you can see is that there is one color that is very reproducibly bad, and that's green. Green has never, I think, exceeded like 3 good cards at a B- level per pod, and this has to do with one thing and one thing only: green commons that were printed in last year's. I don't remember a set that had like 4 really good green commons. At the B- level, you had maybe 3 of them across all those sets, when you could definitely achieve this and more for blue just in Midnight Hunt or just in March of the Machine. So green definitely, the design people should maybe start designing good green commons so that we can actually have a competitive green deck. Or maybe it's a purposeful choice for green to keep it a bit under, so that green can become a color that splashes and uses power that is elsewhere and uses the green for fixing. Maybe. But I don't know. It would be nice to play something that is green and that can stand on its own right without having support from other colors. But important part is you will have those super powerful colors like white and red in LB1, or like blue in March of the Machine, like blue in LCI, like black in Lord of the Rings, like blue in Midnight Hunt, white in Brothers War. All those powerful colors are going to be something that does not point directly to the fact that the format is a pauper, because it's not. It's powerful in white, and because it's powerful in white, some of the white commons are going to be in high win rate, and because of that, you will see a lot of cards being available. So I would say that this metric is interesting, and you can draw many conclusions out of it, and you can observe it very carefully, but I don't think it tells us very much about the pauperiness of the format, calculating how many cards are open at a particular win rate or tier level. So now we go to, I am not going to tell you how many hours I spent to figure that one out, but looking at the percentage of high rarity cards in winning decks. It was mainly to do with very, very large files from 11 formats that needed to be slightly edited before doing anything with them. Takes ages to do, but in the end I got there. And the idea is that in a princely format, high rarity cards will be a requirement to win. And if high rarity cards are a requirement to win in that particular format, there should be a positive correlation between number of rares in a deck and the number of wins. So the more rares you have, the more you win. So trophy decks will have more rares than O3 decks. But in pauper formats, the correlation like that is not obviously going to happen. So maybe it will, maybe it won't. We can't say. Maybe it will be actually a reverse correlation in the pauper formats, that the more rares you have in your deck, the lower your win rate. I basically calculated it for every format since Midnight Hunt, for every win bracket of the deck between 0 wins and 7 wins. And this is the result. So on this graph, what you see here on the y-axis is the deviation from the mean. So if the average number of rares is on that line, anything that is above that particular line means that there's more rares in this category of decks than in the average deck of that particular set. And if something is below the line, it means that there are fewer rares in that particular win bracket of the decks than on average. And as you can see, we actually see a good collection of different curves. We see obviously increasing curves like that one for Crimson Vow, when you see that decks with 0 wins have fewer rares, decks with 7 wins have more rares, and it goes progressively towards that point as you increase the number of wins. But you also see formats like Streets of New Capenna, that's the yellow one. If you can probably stick your eye onto the screen to see which one is yellow, but in Streets of New Capenna, there is not much difference. Decks that have 0 wins and decks that have 7 wins, roughly same amount of rares. Decks that have 3 wins, same amount of rares. Decks that have 5 wins, same amount of rares. There is absolutely no impact in Streets of New Capenna between number of rares in a deck and how many wins that the draft get. And again, we're talking about small difference here, even when we look at things like the Crimson Vow and Kamiganian Dynasty. We're looking at decks with 0 wins have like minus 0.1 rares fewer, and decks with 7 wins will have like plus 0.15 rares per deck. But when you think about it, the average number of rares per deck is around 2. So the difference of 0.25, that's more than 10% difference in terms of how many rares are there. But there is also a couple of sets like LTR and Phyrexia OB1 when there is an inverse correlation. The more rares you have in your deck, the lower the win rate, the lower the worse the outcome of your draft. And it might seem like this is some kind of a counterintuitive interaction. Like, why putting more rares in your deck is going to hurt your win rate. And I know this graph is like super messy, so I can make it simpler, but I needed to show you this so that you will understand why things are working in a particular way. Each of those curves, if you create a trend line for it, will have a slope. And the higher the slope, the more steep that particular curve goes up. So the higher the slope, the bigger the effect of adding more rares into your deck. If the slope is minus, the curve goes down. If the slope is 0, it is flat. So instead of showing you those 11 curves, which can be quite hard to read, I calculated the slopes for all those curves. Hanky MTG in the chat already spoiling everything for everyone. Thank you very much. No, that's a very good answer. Saying that sometimes this slope will be negative because the rares were traps. And I think that this is a partially correct answer. And it's a good direction of thinking. It might be a bit more subtle than that. It's not the rares themselves that were the trap in those particular formats. I think that it was the colors that were traps in those particular formats. And you see that 2 formats with the negative slope are Lord of the Rings and Phyrexia OB1, with roughly like the more rares you put, you lose certain win rate. But for Lord of the Rings, the trap colors were white and green. And of course, people know that they're trap colors. What does it mean if people know? That you are much more likely to be past rares in those colors. Because you're more likely to be past rares in those colors, you will have more rares when you play them, especially that the Grixis colors were very heavily contested. So because you are trying to play something less contested, you will get more rares. But the problem with that is that even though you get more rares, it's still a very low power color. So you're going to lose more, even though you have more rares, because there is no way of you getting many rares in black, because there's probably like 5 black drafters on the pod. So yeah, I think that the negative curve is a good way of detecting whether there were trapped colors that were underdrafted in a particular format. And in Phyrexia OB1, same goes for blue. Blue was underdrafted and blue was underpowered, and you probably could get more blue rares in that particular format because people were actively avoiding playing blue. Midnight Hunt and Streets of New Capenna, they have a sort of like neutral slope. So those two sets, if you put many rares, if you put few rares, doesn't matter for the win rate. It's sort of like even Steven. They have the same kind of level of rare presence in the decks, independently of the how many games you want per draft. Then we have the sort of like 4 sets where rares were sort of adding power to your deck, but not like super heavily. Dominaria United, Brothers War, Wilds of Eldraine, and Mum. So there's the positive slope there, but it's not like particularly steep. And there are 3 sets where adding rares really improved their win rate. And one of them is Lost Caverns of Ixalan, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and particularly Crimson Vow. So these results sort of confirm what the pundits were always saying about those sets, especially Crimson Vow, that Crimson Vow is a very bomb-dependent format. And when you look at it, like every single measure that I did on trying to figure out this princeliness or popperiness of the formats was pointing to Crimson Vow as one of those most princely formats, and that again aligns very well with the intuition of the content creators. So last part, and here we come to the questions that my patrons were asking. So how does this impact those win rates? I decided to look at 2 things, trying to analyze it. One was the draft outcomes by format and see if there is a difference. I was assuming that maybe there will be some draft formats where you owe 1 more, but you also trophy more proportionally. So I plotted like what percentage of the drafts ended up with 0-1 wins, and what percentage with 2-3 wins, and what percentage with 4-5 wins, and what percentage with 6-7 wins. And unfortunately, they all look roughly the same. So you roughly get 25% of the drafts and the 0-0-3 or 1-3 on 17 lands, around 31% of the drafts and 2-3 wins, around 22% of the drafts end up with 4-5 wins, and around 20% of the drafts end with 6-7 wins. There is one exception from the rule, and that's Dominaria United. So you only get like 16% trophy rate. You only get 20% of the 4-5 winners, but you get like almost 35% of the 2-3s and 3-3s, and you get almost 30% of 1-3s and 0-3s. But this is proportional. This is moved in the same direction. So I get fewer trophies and I get more losses, instead of what I was expecting, that I get more trophies, but also I get more losses because the variance in the score outcomes is widening. So no, this is the answer to the question from Lucky Gal. Do we see less polarization in win rates in sets where the power is more concentrated in the rarest mythics? No, we don't see less polarization. We see exactly the same polarization independently of how princely or paupery the particular set is. And same goes to Jack and his question. If the rares do add variance, does that variance actually pour more player win rates towards average? Not necessarily. I don't see anything like that in my particular data that I'm analyzing from here. So then I decided to look at the distribution of player win rates between the 2 extreme sets, because honestly, I didn't feel like analyzing it for 11 sets. Especially that there were some discrepancies between how 17 lens data was structured between those sets. But I plotted the win rates distribution, and this is something that you can find in the 17 lands data. You will not get information about the player, uh, but you will. So you cannot identify the player from the public data sets on 17 lands, but what you can do is you will have which win rate bracket that player is in. So, for example, you will say that if it says bracket 46%, that means that this player's win rate is going to be somewhere between 46% and 47.9999999% win rate. And if it's in the 48% bracket, it's between 48% and 49.9999999, and so on and so forth. So I looked at the distribution of all those brackets, and they look very similar. And when you compare them, yes, you have some differences between the Crimson Vow and Lord of the Rings data, but actually, when you look at them, they even out. Yeah, there is a bit more players in Crimson Vow with like this 42 to 44% win rate. But on the other hand, there is slightly more LTR players with the 46% win rate. And here we have the different flip, like, oh, there's more people in 58% bracket in Crimson Vow, but there is more people in 62% win rate bracket in LTR. Those things very much even out. So I tried to analyze it as much as I could, and I didn't see any kind of difference in the win rate distribution. So this is another answer to the princeliness and the pauperiness of the formats don't really tell us anything about the win rate distribution. By the way, these sets have a very similar generic win rate, so I could compare them like this. If, of course, generic win rate of those two sets would be very different from each other, then it wouldn't be possible to compare those. Okay. So what did we find in the conclusions, basically? The fraction of top 50 cards that are rare and mythic looks like a good measure for what is a princely and what is a paupery set, as does the percentage of rares that made it to the top 50. I think that these are very good measurements of what is a princely and what is a paupery format. Now, questions: how useful it is to determine that the format is princely or paupery? I don't think that it's useful to say that something is a prince or pauper, but I think it's useful to know that this format is more driven by rares and the other format is more driven by commons and uncommons. I think that this is useful to know without even having to classify something as strictly princely and strictly paupery. As we learned in the last couple of decades of being too black and white in assessment of what is what, we learned in the last couple of decades that things are more often on a spectrum, and giving it perfect quantification might be a trap that makes us look at the things too simplistically. Availability of good cards tell us something about the format, but you have to keep in mind that just the fact that you see on average 25 Bs in a format doesn't mean that this format was very paupery. It might mean that this format was very color imbalanced, and because of the color imbalance, commons are piggybacking into the B plus grade without being B plus cards, just because they are powerful cards that gain from the being surrounded by other even more powerful cards. Correlation of rares in deck and the deck wins, it looks like a promising measure, and I am going to think about what to do further with that. This is, of course, first time I'm analyzing anything remotely in this direction, and because it's the first time I'm analyzing it, it's still a learning curve very much, and I need to figure out how to use those data and maybe expand and turn them into something that I can reliably analyze and figure out in my seminars that deal with the current format. All right. Well, these are the findings I had about the princeliness and pauperiness. Important thing is that I think it's good to know if rares are important in the format. I think that looking at the correlation between number of rares and the win rate is an interesting thing. But it's good to know the caveats that thing is laden with. So important to say so. It's going to be interesting to see what's going to be in the new format. It's going to be interesting to see what is the impact of those special card slots on the win rates of things, and different distribution of rarities. Remember, we're going to see the new type of pack. But looking at that, March of the Machine, which has sort of like the similar distribution of the packs as the new pack is going to be. March of the Machine had a high availability of good cards despite having more rares in the pack and fewer commons. So I don't think that the play boosters are necessarily going to hinder pauperiness of formats and make them more princely because there are more rares. I don't think it's a given. I don't think we have to worry about that too much. All right, well, with that, I would like to thank the 17 Lands team because obviously all this data is from 17 Lands. I know that they're entering a very rough period. Few of you know, but actually early streamer access is very important for 17 Lands, and this year this set's been cancelled. So they will have a really rough period before the set release because they don't have that beta testing capability for a couple of days up between this early access event and the full set release. So, thoughts and prayers for them. I would like to thank Fake Jake Brown, who is always helping with the podcast version of it. And I would like to thank my patrons, especially Jack and Lucky Gal for useful discussion in creation of this particular episode, and also to all the new patrons: Pat, Aaron, Christian, Jack, Laura, and Sam. And thanks to MTGA Zone for the sponsorship. And with that, I'll see you on Monday with my special guest, and it's going to be a big one. I think the probably the biggest Magic personality I ever had in my podcast. So please do visit the stream as the questions live, and see you on Monday. And with that, bye.